time and we can get started. We're a few minutes after 4:30. So as you know, delayed start this week, but nevertheless, we're really glad to be here and welcome everyone to the second of the new series of the global webinar. As you know, we're looking at the international system of power, and we're looking at it from different diverse perspectives, different kinds of big issues and institutions, and we're trying to get as many sort of diverse voices to be able to contribute to a discussion about the international system of power. And this week, of course, as you know, we're looking at global power elites and world politics, a really interesting question and issue for so many of us. Last week, we looked at the idea of China from a number of different perspectives as well. So this webinar is designed in a way to try to connect us from different parts of the world, different theoretical and ideological perspectives, different methodologies, studies of different parts of the world as well, so that we get voices from around the world, but speaking about sort of big questions. So up to now, we've managed to kind of create quite an interesting environment and had some really good discussions. And I'm glad to say that we've been really lucky in getting support for this series from the Department of International Politics at City, University of London, but also from the LSE Ideas, from the University of West London, from INEU in Brazil, but also the Miami Institute for the Study of the Social Sciences and the Global Partnership Network at Kassel University in Germany, and finally the Center for Hemispheric and US Studies at the University of Havana as well. So got some really good support from various parts of the world as well. So anyway, I'm going to hand over now to Juvaria to introduce the speakers. It seems at the moment that we are missing one of our scheduled speakers, Peter Phillips, but hopefully he'll be able to join us during the webinar at some point. But Juvaria is going to introduce the panelists for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Inderjeet. So we have three great panelists with us today to discuss global elites. One of them is Matias Lopez Martinez. He's a postdoc fellow at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. He holds a PhD in political science from Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. His research interests include democratic survival in context of high inequality, how distribution is shaped by elites' reaction to the externalities of inequality, and the relationship between corruption and economic preferences. We also have with us today Dr. Nana de Graaf. She is the Associate Professor in International Relations at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. Her main research interests are within international relations, international political economy, and elite studies through a political sociology lens. Her recent publications include Chinese political and economic elites. The subject of her recent publications, which have appeared in refereed journal articles and also book chapters, are around Chinese political and economic elites, the globalization of Chinese firms, US foreign policy in the post-Cold War period, American political and economic elites, corporate elite network, social network analysis, and also the politics and political economy of energy. We will also have joining us Peter Phillips. He's a professor of political sociology at Sonoma State University since 1994. He's also the former director of Project Censored 1996 to 2010, and he's the president of the Media Freedom Foundation between 2003 and 2017. His most recent book is Giants, the Global Power Elite from the Seven Stories Press, which was published in August 2018. He teaches courses in political sociology, sociology of power, sociology of media, sociology of conspiracies, and investigative sociology. He was winner of the Firecracker Alternative Book Award in 1997 for the best political book, and the Penn Censorship Award in 2008, the Dallas Smith Award from the Union for Democratic Communications in 2009, and the Pillar Human Rights Award from the National Association of Whistleblowers in 2014. Thank you for joining us today.
Great, thank you very much, Juvaria. So since Peter was originally scheduled to go first, but it has yet to arrive, Nana has very kindly agreed to speak first. So Nana, you have about 20 minutes and then we'll move over to Peter if he arrives in time, or to Matias if he doesn't. Thank you very much. And members of the audience can begin to put any questions into the Q&A in writing at any point from now on. Thank you.
Thank you, Inderjeet. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I look forward to lively discussions and to presenting some of my ideas and joint work with also Bastiaan van Apeldoorn, who's also in the audience, but will not do any of the presentation here, but he will certainly listen in and maybe help out with the Q&A, or we'll discuss them later. So yes, the title of this talk is called American Elites, Chinese Elites and Sino-Western Relations. And the outline of what I want to discuss, and I'll start my time here, my clock, and Inderjeet, you can keep me sharp because I will have a challenge to keep it within the 20 minutes, but I'll do my best. Okay, so who are the global power elites? Right, and here I think I'll talk a little bit about power structure research, which tends to analyze power elites and global power elites. And then I'll share some of the research and insights from studies on US foreign policymakers and corporate elite networks, as well as some findings on the Chinese global power elites, and then conclude with some implications of these two different elites for US-China relations and the geopolitical rivalry that we see ongoing right now, as well as ongoing corporate elite integration, which seems also a little bit contradictory. So global power elites, who are they? There is a long tradition of power elite research, which of course started with the Power Elite book by C. Wright Mills, the famous sociologist, and has generated a huge body of research. Some of the icons are up here. Bill Domhoff on his series with Who Rules America, Kees van der Pijl with his study of the making of an Atlantic ruling class, and also Bill Carroll, who has published a lot on the making of transnational capitalist classes. But the focus of this research has been predominantly on Western elites, American and European elites, which in light of the rise of the rest, particularly China, but of course also India and other major powers in the global south, is a gap, and that gap needs to be adjusted, about which I will speak more soon. How do these power structure researchers look at global elites? So a power elite basically connects the corporate, political, and military, as well as intellectual, say, policy planning domains in societies, and as such tends to act as a center of wealth and political power. And these elite power structures that power structure researchers tend to study are primarily formed by three kinds of power structures. One is interlocking directorates, which is basically corporate directors sitting at several boards of major firms, oftentimes at the same time, and as such also build solidarity and trust across these firms. Another main venue is policy planning networks, which can be think tanks, research institutes, but also other fora like business councils and so on, more civil society like organizations, which, however, often have a cohesive core that's dominated by the corporate community. I'll get back to that later. And a third elite power structure that's very significant is the revolving door, which is, of course, individuals moving in and out of politics and the corporate worlds. And by that kind of create a connection between those two worlds. And the idea is that through these structures, this elite forges a common worldview, strategies, and consensus, which also goes beyond competing interests of individual firms and individual capitalists. Therefore, it's also sometimes seen as a transnational capitalist class when these structures are actually transnationalized. And there is strong empirical evidence of both national elite, corporate elite networks, and also transnational corporate elite networks. However, in this body of research, two key questions at least remain that I will try to address a little bit today and debate with you later in Q&A. One is, how are these networks, these power structures, related to policymaking? And in particular, we're talking about world politics, foreign policymaking. And the other key issue is, well, what about the rest, right? The focus has been on the West. What about power elites and globalizing power elites outside of the Western core, outside of the so-called liberal heartland? So to speak a little bit about the first, this is work I've been conducting together with Bastiaan van Apeldoorn, and you see some of the publications here to make a little bit of promotion for our work as well. And that research is focusing on American foreign policy makers and the corporate elite networks in which they are embedded. And our point of departure is, well, we want to analyze state behavior, policymaking, foreign policymaking, but we argue that in order to understand that, we have to look at the people that are making up the state and the people that are making foreign policy. So the focus is on foreign policy makers. However, these foreign policy makers are not kind of existing in a social vacuum, but they are, as the quote here also says, located in particular social context, right? So their agency is shaped by wider social power relations in which they are embedded and also mediated by ideas. And in our research, we emphasize three social positions of foreign policymakers to be particularly important in this regard. That's corporate affiliations, policy planning affiliations, and state affiliations. So in this case, former state affiliations. And the way we analyze this is that we actually map social networks of a selection of top foreign policymakers. And we've been looking at the past 4 presidencies, so back to Clinton and until Trump. And we are currently busy mapping the Biden administration. And I'm sure we'll get to that in Q&A. And what we do is that we collect the biographical data of these individuals. We map their ego network, basically. And then we put together all those ego networks. And then you get group patterns, which, of course, we interpret to be elite power structures. Some of the key findings of our research is that we found that 2/3 of the foreign policy makers in each of these administrations, including Trump, had actually corporate affiliations, and that's top-level corporate affiliations before they entered the respective administration. And half of them returned to the corporate world after their service in government. So we found an extensive revolving door pattern. We couldn't assess this for Trump yet, so we can't tell. We also found that in terms of the kind of corporate affiliations, there was a relative dominance of what we conceptualize as transnationally oriented capital. And we look at sectors, for instance, finance and consultancy and corporate law. And so it's very dominant as a sector, but also we look at Fortune 500 and Global 500 notations, which is basically the biggest firms in the world. So that's also an indication of a dominance of transnational oriented capital. A second key finding is that we find these foreign policy makers to be closely linked to policy planning organizations, national policy planning organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Atlantic Councils, and so on, but also transnational policy planning like the Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg, and Aspen. I'll show you that network because I'm not going into all my slides, but just as maybe informative. What you see here is that we have the 3 different administrations, and here in the middle you see these policy planning bodies, think tanks mostly, to which all administrations, foreign policy officials have been recurrently connected. So we take this to be a central policy planning network, which also informs the policy makers and hence the policy making and hence the policy itself. Here we found the most significant discontinuity with Trump, who had hardly any policy planning affiliations at all to his top foreign policy making team, and very non-existent ties to the transnational policy planning, which of course may have influenced his particular foreign policy as well. In turn, we found that these policy planning networks were linked to the same corporate elite networks. They were funded by major American transnational corporations, but also the directors of these think tanks oftentimes had at the same time directing positions on these same big American corporations. Now, these are all the underpinning pictures and slides, but we'll skip that. How do we link this to foreign policy making? So in a nutshell, we argue that this particular corporate profile of the foreign policy makers also informs, influences the kind of foreign policy, which we interpret as an open door foreign policy, linking back to the work of William Appleman Williams, which we see as a strong continuity in US foreign policy making throughout these administrations, but it actually goes back much further in time. And at the core of this foreign policy, of this grand strategy, is the aim to open up spaces and places abroad for capital investment and further capital accumulation. And of course, US capital upfront. And it is also accompanied by liberal ideologies like democracy promotion and American exceptionalism and so on. And of course, we shouldn't forget that this is also underpinned by a globe-spanning military apparatus. Now, we don't see this as one monolithic whole. There are very important intra-elite conflicts and differences still, but we interpret this as a broad consensus around overarching priorities, values, and strategies of US foreign policy, i.e. the aims of the open door foreign policy, but not necessarily the means to achieve those aims. So there are also very important varieties in this open door foreign policy, which we also interpret in our work. I leave this for the Q&A to go further into depth on this. At the same time, these foreign policy elites also, of course, established the basis of US hegemony. We're talking about world politics and what's often called the liberal international order and its key institutions, which of course has been predominant in shaping world politics until the rise of the West, and in particular, the rise of China. And that is what I want to turn to in my final 10 minutes. So, does the rise of China, does it mean that it will challenge the liberal international order and or US hegemony? That's a big debate. It's an ongoing debate. But does it also mean that we see a rise of a new global power elite, maybe a transnational Chinese capitalist class? At least we know that the rise of China has led to the globalization of Chinese capital and corporations. If you look at the global 500, now in 2020, you find 124 to be Chinese transnational corporations. That's significant. And China is, of course, now also the world's second largest investor. So it has been, in terms of Chinese capital, that has really been integrating into the world economy and also into world politics. And the question then, from a elite power perspective and a global elite power perspective, is how is this relating to these incumbent elite power structures that I've just been describing, at least part of it. And vice versa, how do these predominantly Western power elites respond to these emerging Chinese power elites? Of course, this always has to be related to the very distinctive nature of Chinese state capitalism and its political system, its party state system, in which the state owns still a large chunk of the industry and of the companies, but also the party state still has a very pervasive control of the economy and, of course, society in general. So it's not only the size of China that is a challenge, but also its particular the nature of its political economy, and maybe also of its power elite. So how have I been researching this? I've been looking at slices of the top of the Chinese globalizing state corporate elite. For instance, in one study on a selection of major Chinese transnational corporations in the diversity of sectors. And I took the board, the directors of the boards of these companies. I called them China Inc. as a shorthand. And those were 190 individuals, and I mapped their networks, similar to what we did with the foreign policy makers, i.e. I looked at their biographies, at their CVs, and I had a few questions that I wanted to get answered, in what extent and to what extent and in which ways are these Chinese business elites transnationalizing? Are they integrating into Western corporate elite networks? Do they adopt similar patterns of elite formation, or do they maybe form alternative networks? And also, at the same time, how are they domestically linked to elite power structures in politics, in the corporate world, and in policy planning at home? some of the key findings on the corporate elite networking of this Chinese globalizing state corporate elite were that the boards were, of course, in majority inhabited by Chinese directors, but still a substantive share were non-Chinese directors, many Westerners, Americans, and Europeans, 14%. May not sound a lot, but is much more than, for instance, the internationalization of American boards and also of Japanese boards, for instance, the previous Asian challenger. A fourth of the Chinese directors were also educated abroad, and many of them in Ivy League, American and elite British universities. So they were exposed and kind of socialized into the liberal heartland, into the core of the capitalist or the corporate elite networks. They also connect to a wide network of other companies through those corporate affiliations, of which actually almost a third were transnational, and 16% were ties to Hong Kong. And we find in these corporate affiliations a lot of Chinese top largest firms, but also many Western icons like Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, but also big car producers and insurance firms and so on. So there is a recurrent connection to also the top of the Western corporate elite. In terms of policy planning, I also found evidence of connections to a national policy planning network, but the transnational policy planning was more scarce and was mostly established by non-Chinese directors. There were some ties there, however, so that is interesting as like a venue of access towards these transnational, existing transnational policy planning networks connected and to the top of the Chinese corporate elite. And in terms of states connections, maybe not surprisingly, I found that China Inc. directors had a multitude of positions high up in the political system of China, high up in the political party, high up in the state. And these extensions were these connections were very extensive as well. But it should be noted that this did not only apply to the non-Chinese directors in this sample. There were also some Americans and some Europeans that were very well connected to politics. And of course, that is also not a surprise, given what we know from the American foreign policy elite and their interconnections to the corporate world. Let me just skip all the slides. So what are the implications of this? And how much time do I have left for that?
Actually, Nana, you may as well, take a little bit more time because Peter hasn't arrived even yet. So we may as well allow you to develop your argument and so on a little bit more.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I will go into the implications, and at least I'll not feel any rush anymore. And then maybe in the Q&A, we can always go back to all these slides and the questions that may arise from them. But I have been stressing because I wanted to get through the whole story in time. Anyway, so what are the implications of these findings and these on the globalizing Chinese elites and their interconnections with the incumbent elite power structures dominated by the West? So through the directors of China's corporations, they are connecting to these wider transnational corporate networks. They also, we found, adopt some of their Westerners on board and some Western modes of elite networking. What I didn't talk about was, and didn't show, was that the affiliated corporate networks are also increasingly hybrid in terms of their ownership structure. So you see at least half of them are actually not state-owned firms, but public and private firms, and they are increasingly transnational. However, the statist characteristic of Chinese corporate world, China's corporations and its corporate elites remains. Just one example, also in private firms, there is a requirement that there is a party unit, that there's a party secretary, and that also applies for foreign joint ventures, for instance, between Chinese firms and non-Chinese firms. And in general, the party state is kind of increasing its control over capital and firms, whilst at the same time trying to liberalize and transnationalize and privatize even. And that's really a dilemma that I see at the heart of the Communist Party of China, who has, of course, its legitimacy wedded to capitalist growth, which in turn means that, it has to also transnationalize. It has to liberalize partly because of that. It has to increase privatization and more private capitalist dynamics into its political economy and into the core of its growth. But with that, it kind of tends to loosen its control, which then is dangerous. And then they have to try and regain that control. And that's a constant kind of balancing between these contradictory forces in Chinese capitalism. Did I find indications of the Chinese power elite? Well, yes, we found that they were domestically linked to policy planning, and there were extensive interlocks with the party state. Are these indications of integration between the Chinese capitalist class and the transnational capitalist class? I wouldn't dare saying that, but at least there are indications of some adaptation on both sides. We also see the emergence of bridges between the two corporate communities, between the Chinese and the transnational corporate networks. We find important brokers that may act as kind of interlocutors between these communities. That actually connect the top of the corporate world in the West to the top of the Chinese corporate world. And that also means that there is a potential, at least, for intra-elite consensus and trust building across these communities. However, this distinctive Chinese state capital nexus still will determine how this relationship will develop. The Chinese transnational capitalist class still is a state capitalist class, which is really different from Western capitalists in what is sometimes seen as the transnational capitalist class. And we can go a bit more in depth in Q&A about that. To wrap up, just some reflections on what the implications of this are for the current Sino-Western relations, and in particular the ongoing rivalry, and how to interpret this. These are really questions for debate, for further research. I don't have all the answers. What I'm asking myself is what are we seeing? Is this the United States clinging to its hegemony? Is it the making of a new Cold War? Are we actually moving towards decoupling? Is that at all realistic? Or are these more temporary contestations? And me and my co-author, we also have vivid debates about this. We don't always agree, and we don't always have all the answers either. And to what extent is this a struggle between capitalist classes, or is it maybe a struggle between certain fractions or factions of these capitalist classes, or is it more of a political struggle, a geopolitical struggle? How does the transnational capitalist class relate to the Chinese state? To some extent, it is of course seen as an unwelcome interference of their freedom or to invest. Let's talk about level playing field and reciprocity and state interference, political motivations, and so forth. But at the same time, we see that in spite of all the contestation going on, foreign investments in Chinese bonds are rising. They have doubled in the past 2 years. Financial integration is growing. Just yesterday, BlackRock got approved a joint venture with Chinese banks to be in charge of wealth management in China, and that's it's an 18.9, it's on the slide here, trillion market. If you look at business surveys from the Chamber of Commerce, there's lots of criticism, but the positive assessment is outweighing the criticism. In the end, if the question is there, like, would you rather leave China? The question is always no, right? So how should we interpret this? Is this an indication of growing Chinese market power? So in spite of the criticism, there is no way that China will be neglected. And then, of course, there will also be an interest of the transnational capitalist class in the Chinese state, rather than only being protected against it. It might also want to ally with the Chinese state, actually, in order to sustain its capital accumulation. Last question is, will this integration, if it's going to be there, if it's going to continue between the Chinese transnational capitalist class and the transnational capitalist class, will it act as a counterforce, and like, will it create more mutual understanding, maybe some consensus, or will it instead fuel the division and fuel the ongoing politicization? In terms of the theoretical debates, as far as I'm concerned, the debate between whether we are moving towards increased inter-imperial rivalry or a more Kauskian scenario or something in between or something completely new is still unclear and unanswered. And I look forward to all your questions and ideas on this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nana. That's really interesting new research, which obviously I haven't heard before, and I'm sure no one else has either. So look forward to kind of asking some questions and sort of clarifying and maybe deepening some of the knowledge that you've already gained. And if Bastian, your co-researcher, wants to supplement anything, then very, very welcome to do so as well. So since Peter Phillips doesn't appear to be able to join us, we will, if it's okay, Matias, go on to you now. So we have Matias Lopez Martinez from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And the title of his talk is How Corruption Shapes Economic Preferences Within the Elite, and it's a case study of Brazil. Thank you.
Yes, well, no, thank you. Let's hope that Peter is all right. But yes, the presentation it's really an ongoing. This is the last thing I'm working in, so this is very fresh. I'm eager to know about the reactions, and this is connected to the project on elites and unequal democracies here at the Graduate Institute with Graziella Moraes Silva. And it's a dive, it is a dive in Brazil. All right, okay. So I would start briefly by just saying how this issue of corruption is framed in the literature and why does it matter for political studies. What you see here is VDEM's geographical distribution of their corruption index. Like everything in varieties of democracy, this is done by asking experts in each country a series of questions related to corruption, and then they create this index. And as you can see, the geographical distribution of this maps really well with what we think of in terms of economic development in general, which illustrates this idea that corruption hurts development, that it hurts economic growth. Now, there's not a lot of evidence in terms of causality, but there's a very robust association between different measures of corruption and the economic problems and also democratic problems. So the question is, why does that occur? And a very popular theory or way of looking at this is through an economic lens. So there's this idea that what's often called the micro foundations of corruption are conductive to roadblocks to development. And in a nutshell, I would say the basic argument is that corrupt elites will try to maximize the rents that they can obtain from corruption, and therefore they will promote more public spending, a more important role for the government in the economy, and that in order to increase rents, and that will create a series of inefficiencies, and in the end, that would make this mechanism that connect the incentives that elites have when they are allowed to be corrupt and maul economic performance in the end. Now, as every assumption in social science, this is an assumption, just like you know that I'm wearing a tie and shirt, but you're assuming I'm wearing pants. So it's logical, but it hasn't been tested yet. And my idea with this, in this part of the project, was trying to test whether it is true that corrupt elites act upon those kinds of incentives. And as mentioned, I will look at the case of Brazil, which is a very popular case of corruption. You know, the corruption shapes the Brazilian political system from several angles, and I'll be happy to discuss particular dimensions of the Brazil's corruption problem in the Q&A. But one of the basic puzzles in the Brazilian literature currently is that Brazil was actually taking off, as illustrated by the covers of The Economist. It was booming economically since the election of the Workers' Party, and it was also very successful at redistributing that economic growth. And in the middle of the Workers' Party's very long term in office, things collapsed. And a very popular interpretation for why that happened has to do with the corruption scandals that were unveiled throughout the administration. So the most famous, I would say, and most important of those corruption schemes was the one taking place at Petrobras. Can you see my browser? Yes, right? So Petrobras is the state-owned oil company. And there was this massive anti-corruption task force called Operation Car Wash, which was later found to be corrupt itself. But I'm not going to spare you of those sordid details. And what they found out was this system where a cartel of private companies, which are right here, would funnel bribes into Petrobras, in particular to political appointees from the parties in the government coalition, right? So here you have PT and you have a whole set of other more right-wing parties that were part of the governing coalition. And those political appointees would keep some of the bribes to themselves, of course, but would channel part of them to the parties, and those companies would also send money directly to the parties in the form of electoral campaign donations, both official and off the books donations, mostly off the books donations. And in exchange, the parties would assure that Petrobras would make very sweet deals with companies, and then they would receive a bunch of money back and use part of that money for more bribes, and so on and so forth. So if we look at this organogram, this really looks like those economic micro foundations of corruption, pure and simple, right? People, corrupt elites, both in business and in political parties, want to maximize rents, and therefore they spend more infrastructure projects, more public spending in order to generate more opportunities for rent extraction. Now there's a catch. There's a catch here, which is that most of Brazilian party don't have a really strong program or ideological identity, in particular in economic terms. Many of them are very conservative in moral terms, but they are not either neoliberal or left-wing. So you have the PSD, for instance, the leader of the PSD famously said that the PSD is not a left-wing party, not a right-wing party, and also not a centrist party. But the PT, the Workers' Party, is really an exception to that. The Workers' Party is the classical social democrat party. It's union-based, a very strongly programmatic party with a very clear economic and social program, that it's a Keynesian economic program and a developmentalist economic program. So most of these policies that would be fostered and part of these corruption schemes in Petrobras and in other parts of the government were actually compatible with the Workers' Party's program. It is what they said they were going to do in order to develop the country. So this brings a question, what is it more important for these elites? Is it the program that they are in theory committed to, Or are these economic incentives of corruption really working and deviating them from the kind of investment that they would make otherwise? So in a way, would the Workers' Party elites have acted differently if they were not embedded in this chain of corruption gains? So the data I used to try to generate some evidence for either one theory or the other comes from this elite survey that colleagues and I did in Brazil in between 2013 and 2014, and they were happy to replicate. If it wasn't the pandemic, we would be replicating it right now. We'll probably replicate it in September. So what we did is that we selected at random the Congress people and political appointees from the main parties and CEOs from the 500 main companies in the country. And our intention was, of course, to know the political preferences and attitudes of the elites in Brazil. And in the middle of that, the car wash corruption scandal exploded, and they generated just this ginormous amount of data on who was part of which corruption scheme, and it really generated data about all the parties, including the opposition. So after we got the survey back, I looked at the elites from different parties and the business elites, and I looked if they were, in the files of corruption of car wash operation and other operations, to separate the ones that were benefiting from that, from those illegal rents, from those that were not, the political elites that were receiving bribes, and the companies that were providing those bribes. And I was surprised to find, and I think that's also some evidence that the randomization worked, that 30 of those sampled elites, 31 of those sampled elites were the corrupt elites that were in those schemes. And as I mentioned, they belong to different parties, which some of them are corrupt, but are also very programmatic, and most of them are not very programmatic. All right, now what you see here is the distribution of the sample with this separation, right? The ones that were benefiting from the corruption schemes and the ones that were not. And unfortunately, the sample is not very large, so it's a small sample of corrupt elites. But on the other hand, it's a very high quality sample, because this is just a random sample of the population of elites, of political and business elites in Brazil. And they were also, there's no, I was actually surprised to see that they would participate. And the distribution within parties, it kind of maps the how corrupt those parties are. So PMDB, for instance, is the only one where we sampled more corrupt elites than non-corrupt elites. And that's because PMDB is a very rentier party that's been benefiting from, it was part of the governing coalition ever since democratization. It was never outside the government. All right, so what well, as I said, it was a survey intended to measure elites' preferences regarding a different range of issues. And a set of those issues naturally has to do with policy. We asked two kinds of questions. First, there was a whole set of questions aiming at preference for public spending. So we asked elites whether they would prefer to spend more in health, in infrastructure, in education, and so on and so forth. And they would have to answer, well, yes, I want to spend less, about the same, or more. And there's another set of questions that maps their preferences for more neoliberal policies like privatization, deregulation, that kind of the kind of economic policy versus another set of questions that would ask if they agree on another range of policies that were more clearly developmental or statist or Keynesian. So, you know, financing projects to get more jobs, more participation of the government in the economy, more benefits to public employees, and that kind of thing. And what I did was that I combined the two sets of questions in two different indexes. So there's one index is for public spending. So it would measures whether elites on average want more public spending or less public spending, ranging from 0 to 1. And in the second set of questions, an index that ranges from neoliberal preferences towards statist preferences. Now, if we take, you know, if we take a hard bet on that economic interpretation of how corruption works, what we should observe is that the elites should, as they benefit from illegal rents from corruption, they should favor more spending, and they should also become less neoliberal and more Keynesian or more statist. I mean, want a bigger role for the government in the economy. That assumption, of course, had led, particularly in Latin America, to a lot of anti-corruption advocates making the issue for neoliberal reform, right? So a big ideological pillar for neoliberal reform in Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America is that, well, if we privatize, if we go all the way, do the neoliberal turn, then, you know, those corrupt elites they will be against that. You know, it's a way of fighting corruption. What you see here is a scatter plot of how those two measures relate. So below in the x-axis, you have the neoliberal statist index, and in the y-axis, you have preference for less or more spending. And those two measures, they have linearity between them, which, you know, so more neoliberal people want to spend less, and more Keynesian or statist people want to spend more. And you also observe that the distribution of elites, it makes sense in the sense that you have corporate elites being more neoliberal and preferring less investment, and the Workers' Party elites on the upper right section of the scatter plot preferring more Keynesianism and more public spending. Looking at the Workers' Party, in the thick line, you have the political elites that were part of those corruption schemes. And in the dotted part of the plot, we have the elites that were not part of those schemes. And at least visually, what we get is that the corrupt Workers' Party elites have, on average, kind of the same. They are within the group of the Workers' Party in general. They don't seem to be very different from their party peers. And as I mentioned, the Workers' Party is a strongly programmatic party, so it has a strong identity with Keynesianism and public investment and that kind of developmental framework. And here you have the business elites, the corporate CEOs from the top 500 companies, and the picture seems to be quite different. So the corrupt elites, which are on the thick black cloud, are more towards the northeast if compared to the other corporate elites. So it seems that there might be different from, in that sense, they relate to that economic prediction that they would prefer more investment in more spending and a bigger role for government as they benefit from corruption. Taking a look at this more, in a more statistical approach, here we have just the mean difference in this index of public spending. And if you look at the result for PT, there's hardly any difference between the PT elites that were part of the corruption schemes and the PT elites that were not. In parentheses, you have the confidence interval for that. And the same seems to be the case for the other parties as well. However, when we look at the corporate elite, then we do see that that expected difference between the two groups. You have elites that in corporations that benefited. Oh, here's Peter. Hey.
Hi.
All right, but let me move on, sorry. And so you have elites in corporations that they were part of those corruption schemes with government, and if you compare their average preference for public spending, they prefer more spending comparison to the other corporate elites. Now, this doesn't mean that the other corporate elites are not corrupt in a broader sense, because corruption takes several forms. It just means that those elites were not part of those particular corruption schemes in the federal government. Now, looking to neoliberal versus statist differences, there are some more relevant effects. Again, the corporate elites tend to be less neoliberal when they benefit from rent seeking in Brazil. And the PSD, as I mentioned, is the party that is not nor left nor right and also not center. So it's a very malleable party ideologically. It has no party program whatsoever. And in it, there is an effect in the sense that the corrupt elites within PSD do favor a bigger role for the government in the economy.
Yes.
Yes.
Couple of minutes, I think.
Sure. This is my last slide. But again, in the Workers' Party, we observe no effect. So there are three takeaways from those results. The first is that what is assumed in the literature as the micro foundations of corruption seem to work better for economic elites and not for political elites, or at least in the case of Brazil, for political elites from parties that are very programmatic. So in the case of the Workers' Party, the elites that benefited from rent seeking, they would stick to the party program when asked about those preferences, whether they show different preferences, which brings the point that political elites are more political, and that we should bring politics back to the study of corruption, and even wonder whether there are programmatic reasons for being corrupt and not only economic reasons for being corrupt. This is it for now. I'm anxious for comments. If you have any, I'm very thankful for the invitation.
Great. Thank you very much, Matias. That's very, really interesting. And we look forward to the Q&A for you as well. I'm really glad to say that Peter Phillips has now joined us, and I just want to welcome him. Thank you, Peter, for persevering with the technological issues and so on. But it's really good to see you. So please, whenever you're ready, please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm very, very honored. I'm going to talk about my book, Giants, the Global Power Elite, which was a study. The data from the study is mostly from 2017. And I was concerned with originally my research has always been on elites in the United States, basically, going back to C. Wright Mills and his book, The Power Elite, 1956. And I was, as an undergraduate, read Bill Domhoff's work, Who Rules America? And he ultimately was on my dissertation committee. But I was, very inspired by the research that sociologists were doing here in the US. And then I read Leslie Sklar's book in 2000 on the transnational capitalist class. And I started thinking a lot about, okay, well, how much is this a class? How interconnected are people transnationally? And felt that it was really important to assess that and look at that. I mean, I remember 20 some years ago, Holly Sklar, when she was interviewed about trilateralism, she said, well, these are the elites of the world. I kind of like they're planning what's going to happen to us. I kind of like to know what that's going to be. That's why we study them. So I think that's an important indication that there are elites. They are making decisions that affect all of our lives. And as much as we can know about them, it's really important. So David Rothkopf wrote that book, The Superclass, and he narrowed it down to 6,000 to 7,000 people that he said were the 1,000th of 1% that were the Davos attending policy leaders of the world, and that they interacted in a variety of ways, often through the major institutions like the World Bank, the G20, the G7, the WTO, the Board of Settlements, and would rehash these things in a number of ways. The policy groups like the Group of 30, the Trilateral Commission, and the Atlantic Council, I see as the leading policy groups in the world today. There are others, but these are privately funded organizations of business elites and government elites making policy plans that are looked at very strongly by administrations in power. So whether it's Trump or Obama, they're very aware of what the Atlantic Council is saying, what the Trilateral Commission is saying and recommending, what the G30 is saying, and pay attention to that. So that has a strong influence on government administrators in terms of the decisions they're making and policy direction. The Atlantic Council is particularly capable of making decisions relative to transnational intelligence activities. The US CIA and other intelligence agencies that are from capitalist countries interact, and they will engage in regime changes and wars and that to find governments worldwide that are in support of and allow capital investment and capital to be taken from their regions by the global 1%. Having said all that, I looked at in 2017, there was approximately $250 trillion worth of wealth in the world. A lot of that's tied up in buildings and patents and trade agreements and goods. But there's a significant amount of money that's just cash, and it gets invested in stocks or growth opportunities by usually private investment companies like BlackRock or JP Morgan Chase. They manage people's money for them. So I was looking at the largest ones, and there are 17 companies that I list in the book that managed over $1 trillion of capital. So that was kind of my cutoff. I called them the giants if they had $1 trillion, and then there were near giants that were, but I needed to cut off a sociological concept of who these giant companies were. And so the $1 trillion mark was what I set. The biggest at that time was BlackRock at 5.4 trillion, Vanguard at 4.4 trillion, JP Morgan Chase at 3.8, Alliance SE, PEMCO at 3.3, etc. So the total of these 17 companies, the total amount they held was $40 trillion. And that was a very concentrated group. And so I just wanted to say, okay, well, who are the decision makers in these companies? So I identified the people on the board of directors, did bio checks on them as best as possible, estimated their net wealth, looked at their backgrounds in terms of education and policy involvements. And those 200 people, it's actually 199, were managing and making decisions for $40 trillion. It's higher now, of course, but $40 trillion in the world, just 200 people. And they essentially know each other or know of each other, and are what I would call the core of transnational capitalist class policy direction, or handling of how money is used in the world. So they can make a decision whether to invest in an armaments company or soybeans in Brazil or whatever. That's their choice. That having said that, that wealth concentration is quite amazing. It represents, of course, 34 million millionaires and almost 3,000 billionaires today. It's their excess capital placed in investment opportunities. Now, they've got a couple of problems. One of their biggest problems is finding adequate investment opportunities to get us, a 7% return or better. And there's not enough companies with that amount, trillions of dollars, with 40 trillion. There's not enough places to invest it safely. So that leads to speculative investments, like the subprime mortgage crisis that we had, a decade ago or better. They will invest in places where it's risky, and that risk is always a problem. They still have too much capital, and so one of the ways of using up capital is for them to buy up public resources. So they'll buy land, they'll buy water rights, they'll buy educational systems, wherever they can turn a profit. It's a privatizing the world. So they're in a situation where they want to try to do that and acquire vast amounts of fixed assets to use worldwide. So that threatens, of course, the commons for all of us. And that's an ongoing process of that. And it's still, there is not enough opportunity for good investment returns for all of them. So one of the ways that governments assist with that is war spending or engaging in military activities. So permanent war, which we've seen now for a very long time in the world, and the US has 800 bases and is occupying 100, or has troops or training going on in most of the nations in the world. This amount of spending is very profitable, and one way of continuing to protect concentrated global capital. So each of the governments that are capitalist not only interact with each other, but the government authorities know that this agenda is number one, is protecting global capital. So we'll take policy recommendations from this group to make sure that Wall Street and the investment banks worldwide are protected and safe. As this wealth gets concentrated even more, so BlackRock went from 5.4 to over 7, pushing 8 trillion now that they're managing. So that concentration is reflected, of course, in what William Robinson called the crisis of humanity. And his book, Global Capitalism, The Crisis of Humanity, lays out the contradictions of wealth concentration, the continued failure to address issues like poverty and global hunger, and that it's not profitable. So there's no investment or little investment in those areas. So 80% of the world, people in the world, are living on less than $10 a day. These are UN figures. Half are living less than $2.50 a day. And over 30,000 die every day from malnutrition and easily curable diseases. So there's this massive daily death toll from the structure of capitalism and the continued concentration of wealth. Now there's individuals like Jamie Dimon, who's JP Morgan Chase, or Larry Fink, who's BlackRock. They think about this. They've had protesters in front of their homes on a number of issues. Jamie Dimon just agreed that they were going to try to limit their capital investment in military companies. There's some concern with investing in the oil companies and the continued crisis of the environment and global warming. But they're in the business to manage money and take returns. So if it doesn't continue, they're not going to be doing that. I mean, if they can't make returns, they're not going to be retained as CEOs, or will they they'll be making decisions that are going to benefit their investors. So we have this kind of situation where the world is faced with continued war, continued mass poverty, and daily deaths from starvation, a massive amount of difficulties with the environment that we're facing. So they all know this. And when they're in Davos, they talk about these concerns. And we're seeing now from Klaus Schwab, his new work and efforts through the World Economic Forum to develop policies that they're calling the Great Reset. And this is trying to get companies, they've got about 150 now signed up, to make adjustments in their investment policies, to protect the environment. That's the number one concern, so that we're not destroying the world and we don't keep heating up and melt all the ice caps. That's kind of ongoing, but they're aware of this, and they're making efforts to what they're called as Great Reset. But it has a dual purpose. They want to diminish global warming, but they also want to protect global capital investment. So that's their number one priority, as it is with capitalism worldwide. So each of these groups, it works through policy councils and advises governments in terms of activities and what to do. And what's amazing to me is this is a very small number of people. I list 389 people in the book by name and who they are. But also, it's important to recognize that the 17 giants, the transnational investment companies, they're all invested in each other. There's $400 billion of co-investments between all the companies. So they're one single unit, literally, of global capital, watching each other, investing in each other, making many of the same moves with the same interests. And it's a very small number of people. So I would say that this is the central core of global capitalism that is being protected by governments, capitalist governments, their intelligence agencies, their military, and people in power in these governments recognize that this has to be maintained and developed. So in combination with that, these giants are also invested in media. Each of the global media corporations is heavily invested by these transnational giants. They're invested in security. Of course, the militaries are run by governments, but also there's massive private security operations ongoing. The biggest is G4S with 625,000 employees worldwide. So they guard things. They will do mercenaries and kill people. I mean, this is private military ongoing. BlackRock, of course, is right in there in that regard. And these investment companies are also own the big public relation firms like Omnicom, WPP, and Interpublic Group, the little largest PR firms in the world. They work for everybody. They are in the business of promoting sales and continued capitalism. So after 9/11, we all remember Bush saying to everybody, when they said, how can we help? He said, go shopping. And even in San Francisco, a patriotic movement with little bags, red, white, and blue bags that stores put in their windows to encourage people to go shopping to fight terrorism. So, I mean, it's just kind of amazing to me how all that is engaged. At the end of the book, we write a letter, and I'm co-signed by 100+ friends of mine and other professors from around the world, telling the global power elite that they're causing a crisis that's unsustainable, that they can't continue to concentrate wealth and destroy the environment the way they're doing it without threatening their own, sorry about my dog, threatening their own, he's chasing the cat, threatening their own grandchildren, the lives of their families, their future. So we know that that's got to be a concern to them. There's actually, if we engage in total war, there's no place that they can be protected. And so, we're facing a global crisis. That's what Robinson talks about. My response to that is that all of us need to be engaged in challenging this, recognizing the authority and the control that these people have, and engaging in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and insisting that those be implemented worldwide. So that's my work in a nutshell.
Great, thank you very much. It's a shame that we haven't had more time to develop more fully your evidence base and the kind of linkages between these elites, financial elites and so on, and the kind of policy makers. But I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions coming for you and for the other speakers as well. But thank you, Peter, for joining us.
I'm very happy to be here. I can stay for about 45 more minutes.
Great. Well, we technically only have another 15 minutes, but sometimes we do go over time as well. So what I'm going to do now is we've got 3 questions already in the Q&A. I'll start with the first one first. And this one is for you, Nana. Lee Marsden, a good friend from the University of East Anglia, a professor there, asks, he talks about you mentioning the Trump administration not coming from the usual kinds of think tanks, although Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo have gone to Heritage and Hudson Institute. So in a way, there's a kind of linkage there. But he's asking, to what extent does Trump's mastery of social media, or did Trump's mastery of social media, neutralize the influence of the corporate power elite, given his ability to kind of say things and cause shares to rise or to tumble almost at will? So did he kind of go around that corporate elite as a result of the kind of power that he had through social media, and how did he sort of, in your view, sit outside of that kind of matrix, as some people claim?
Yeah, with regard to the first question, so there were, of course, individuals in the Trump administration that were linked to this policy planning network, but the ties were much scarcer than was the case in the other administration. So if I would show you the networks, you see a tight network, extensive network across all these administrations, and with Trump it kind of disappears. But that doesn't mean that there were still a few ties. Another thing to take into account is that we only map the affiliations of the policymakers at the time they were appointed to a particular presidency, right? So in Trump, that meant 2017. We looked at those individuals and the ties they had before entering administration. In the case of Trump, so we didn't map any future appointments that they had, and also we couldn't map this revolving door. But I mean, you're right that there were some of these ties. Still, we think that in terms of the connection is so much, there's so much discontinuity, so that to some extent must have influenced the the coherence and the lack of coherence, actually, to a large extent, and the ideological outlook and worldview that underpinned the foreign policy of Trump. And also, it raises the question: so what were the actual sources, like ideological sources, of his worldview and of his foreign policy? And we have to look elsewhere. We cannot look to the usual suspects, to the mainstream, to the blob, the foreign policy think tanks that have been influencing and shaping US foreign policy before Trump. The other question, I don't have a full answer to that, and I think Trump had a troubled relationship, not only to, say, the foreign policy establishment, the blob, which he partly never kind of allied with, and which he partly, well, to a large extent, actually sidelined. And with the corporate elite, it's somewhat different. I mean, he was partly very well connected to the corporate elite, right? And he profited a lot from that. And he would not risk those relations either. In the Trump administration, there were even more millionaires and billionaires than before. So to some extent, if you talk about wealth and power through wealth, Trump was, of course, very well connected. But it was partly a different kind of corporate elite than the more transnationally oriented corporate elite that we saw in the other administrations or presidencies. Many more, say, self-made millionaires, self-made businessmen running huge, self-made business empires, more real estate, which had a more national focus also. Right, which was also more in line with probably America first interests and buy America interests, and a more protectionist, more domestically focused economic policy as well.
Just on that point, Nana, and following on from Lee's question, there is this new America First Policy Institute with $20 million, which has been set up quite recently by ex-Trump administration people to explore certain areas of policy. I want to ask a question which to Peter actually, but which arises from something which Nana also said in her presentation. Peter, you missed it, but Nana said that from the evidence of Chinese corporate elites and their linkages with Western corporate elites, she found in her sample of Chinese corporations that 14% of the board of the companies that she studied were Western or American corporate directors. And I guess the question I would like to ask and extend from that is, to what extent do the global elites that you've studied, what are their linkages with, for example, China or Russia or India or Brazil, the other BRIC powers? Are they interconnected, or how deeply and in what ways, if they are? You're muted, Peter.
BlackRock, just a few years ago, opened their investment bank in Beijing. Number of the companies in the giants have operations in China, in Shanghai or Beijing. They welcome, Chinese capital in terms of investment. They would like to see and penetrate even greater the Russia and China. What we're seeing from the Atlantic Council in terms of policy recommendations, they were recommending regime change in Russia 5 years ago. And of course, Putin is well aware of that. But recently they did a report on China and were pushed to saying it was time that in the next decade or so for a regime change in China as well. So in China, the Politburo, of course, it runs the country. And here in the United States, global elites, the powerful, the billionaires, influence and control the US government far more than Chinese billionaires do in China. So it's very concentrated here in terms of wealth influence, and less so in China. The Chinese are very aware of capital investment and how they're doing and what's happening. And I think, but want to make sure they protect not only their system, but their people. They've made great progress, as has Russia, in upgrading and eliminating poverty and upgrading the economic positions of most of the people in their country. So, you know, they were starting at a lower base, but they've done quite well. And I think that literally the global elites are salivating over the possibilities of investment throughout the Russian territory and greater investment opportunities with the Chinese, because that alleviates their pressures to find general good kinds of investment opportunities. So if that were open more broadly, perhaps, we would still have the ultimate problem of poverty and inequality in the world, and continuing environmental destruction. But maybe if there was greater investment in the short term, there might be less war. That I couldn't, you know, totally say what would happen, but I look at these interplays and how this is how we think about it. And my best guess is that they would, you know, if they had those opportunities to invest, that we would see a lot of money going in that direction. And you know, a lot is made of how China is, you know, a balance of payments is greater to them. But most of that money, at least half of it, is US firms making products in China and then bringing them over here to sell. So, and we're aware of that inconsistency. So I think there's a lot to be said. And I would like to spend more time in my next book showing these linkages and really talking about this in the context of China and Russia.
Okay, I mean, Nana finished her presentation with some really interesting questions about the future of that kind of relationship, and you've kind of pressed a bit further on from there as well. But so how do you explain the Cold War Chile type politics and the rhetoric when you have this underneath it? You know, you talk about $40 trillion, you talk about massive numbers of amounts of investment and trade and financial connections and so on. So how do you then account for the sheer amount? You know, look at Australia, the Britain, the United States, Canada, and the big powerful Western countries, despite the fact that their capitalist elites have so much at stake in China and other countries like Russia. How do you account for the fact of the Cold War style rhetoric, which is the dominant rhetoric in the politics and diplomacy at this time? How do you account for it?
Well, with Putin, the coup that the U.S. arranged in Ukraine, and the transfer of investment opportunities to a greater extent for U.S. capital or global capital into Ukraine, Putin's position that Crimea was not going to go away, that they needed that naval base, they needed that power. Most of the people in Crimea were Russian anyway, and so they voted quite openly to stay with Russia. The agenda, what was stated here was that Putin had invaded the Crimea and occupied it. That was what the report 5 years ago, and the Democrat Party really got behind that. Obama did, and certainly and Clinton. I mean, we may have had Clinton won the election against Trump, we may have seen a much more severe conflict with Cold War conflict with Russia than we saw under Trump. And he was heavily criticized for being too friendly with Russia anyway. And then it ultimately became that, oh, well, he was, supported by the Russian communists, and they were hacking in and making changes and stuff like that. So I think the agenda is still there. There is a crisis in capitalism for investment opportunities. Russia hasn't been fully cooperative with that, nor has China, nor of course other places, whether it's Cuba, Venezuela, or North Korea, and intense competition in India and other places. So there is a capitalist Cold War ongoing in terms of opportunities for investment that politicians are fully aware of, and then initiate policies to try to mediate that in some way.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Felipe Loureiro from Brazil for Matias, who has two questions. He says, how do you define corrupt elites, given that many of the decisions of the car wash operation either have been overturned or may be overturned in the near future because of the irregularities? And secondly, do you agree with the claim that the wave of judicialization of corruption cases in Latin America during the 2010s was part of a US-driven effort to take the left-wing and progressive governments out of turn them out of office?
Sure, thank you, Felipe, for the question. Yeah, as I mentioned briefly, one of the complex dimensions of the whole thing is what that car wash turned out to be corrupt itself, right? So as Felipe mentioned, they were colluding among themselves and with the business leaders and even parties to overthrow the Workers' Party. That's very clear right now. Anyway, so that's a known fact at this point, right? But the thing is, what I did is that I looked at the evidence of those corruption schemes, whether people were receiving bribes or not, or whether they were part of some network that was funded by bribes. And I coded that as corruption. Now, the fact that that was done in the wrong way and for political purposes, it doesn't really affect my coding, but it does add complexity to the case. If we go further, after the Workers' Party government collapsed, the Bolsonaro, who was elected on an anti-corruption campaign, was also demonstrated to be quite corrupt himself. So, about the American interest in car wash, I don't know. I mean, I don't have any research about that subject. I read things in the news as everyone else. It's clear that there was some American intervention, but then the counterfactual, is just like the coups in Latin America. Would they have occurred without American interference or not? It's very hard to say. What we know at this point is that there were connections between Lava Jato and the American and the FBI in particular. But whether that changed the results, that's an estimation that's hard to make.
Okay, thank you. We have another question for you from Flavia, who asks, can you please develop your conclusion regarding the need to look more at politics than economics in the study of corruption? How does it relate to evidence that corporate interests are actually involved in corruption, and they tend to be the same corporations even as administrations change?
Sure, I think that's a great point, because well, there is this abstract modelization of corruption that I mentioned, whether corrupt elites, without specifying who the elites are, should try to maximize rents as much as they can. But if you start to differentiate party elites from economic elites, you see that parties come and go, and the economic elites, they stay. So the companies that make good, profitable contracts with the government during one administration are basically the same ones that were profiting from previous administrations and even previous regimes in the country. So I guess my way of trying to unpack that is that there are maybe this economic theory of corruption works very well for business elites, for economic elites, for profit oriented. But it may not work as well for party elites, in particular for strong parties that have a more political explanations for their attitudes and their tolerance for corruption, or even their participation in corruption.
Thank you, Matias. Question for Nana from myself. That is, you looked at these the kind of interconnections between on the boards of Chinese corporations. 14% were from Western societies. I just wondered, do you have any impression about change over time? Or is this like a snapshot in a particular year, as in 2020 or something like that? Do you have any idea, when did it begin? When did it begin to get, I mean, 14% is actually quite a lot, quite a high proportion. And I just wondered, with all this talk about decoupling from China and so on, whether that Trump effect actually exhibited itself in any way in those boards and their members.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have longitudinal data, so it is indeed a snapshot, especially what I discussed here. I did a follow-up study, which was a few years later, but I don't think you will see the Trump effect if it's there at all, which I doubt actually. But if it would be there, you would probably see it. We looked at the interlocking directorates of directors of China's largest firms, a much wider sample, but we only included interlocks with European boards. So we looked at, are there these Sino-European interlocks? And these were real interlocking directors. So at the same time, sitting at the Chinese board and sitting at the European board. And we found a significant number of directors having those interlocking directorates. So, and that's in that sense, I think that the trend is still there. But I don't have like the way it has developed over time. So for instance, it would be super interesting to see, from China started going global, say early this millennium or so, or even 10 years back. How do we see this develop? And of course, it will be very interesting to see what will happen in the future, which goes back to my earlier questions and your question, which I think is really the $1 million question here. How will global corporate elite integration, how will it further develop in light of this fierce geopolitical contestation that's now at least being constructed very heavily by the American political power elite? So, yeah.
Thank you. I know, Nana, you've got to go quite soon, but hopefully we can still get you for a few minutes. But there's a question which is in my mind for both you and Peter. I know you both have an interest to some level or other in the Trilateral Commission, for example, and the kind of integrative role it has played since the 1970s when it was formed. And I was recently looking up that the Asia Pacific group, of which Japan is kind of the leading one, has 9 members. That's the Asia Pacific group in the Trilateral Commission has 9 members from China. And what does that mean? Is that kind of like supplementary to these corporate interlocks, board members, this, kind of, and the sort of work that you've done, Peter, as well, where there's all this vast amount of investment. I mean, 9 doesn't sound too many members given the size of the weight of China, geopolitically, militarily, and in other ways. But I just wonder, does that just sort of add to the kind of line of thinking that you've been pursuing, or what does it do with that?
Shall I start? I mean, yes, I think that is significant and maybe not unexpected. And I would, in principle, I would expect that to increase these kind of linkages. I think that the Chinese are trying to also be present at those more policy planning, informal kind of elite planning bodies. It's maybe more difficult than getting corporate board interlocks, but I do think there will be a huge interest. And actually, there have also been attempts, but I forgot the names, and then it failed at some point. But I didn't do research in it to kind of establish similar organizations in China. There was actually supposed to be a headquarter in Beijing, I think, or Shanghai, but I think even Beijing, which would be kind of an alternative network to say Trilateral Commission, which would not only include, which would also include like Americans and so on. So it wasn't supposed to be like excluding them, but to have an alternative, like China is now starting all kinds of alternatives. Think of the Asian infrastructure and investment bank, right? So they build just similar institutions actually, but in which they have also a share and also a role, and in which they have influence, which they feel that they lack in many of these global governance institutes, including the informal ones like Trilateral Commission or World Economic Forum and so. Yeah, but I would expect it to increase. Yeah.
I think that it's important to remember that the Trilateral Commission is made up of business elites, or perhaps social elites as well, but not governmental. If you're in the government, then you're uninvited, literally, or you have to find somebody that will be a member. So there's 400 or so people in the Trilateral Commission. They've made a great effort to internationalize that. They have the different bodies in Europe and Asia and here, and they meet annually, of course. But so there's a real effort to include or have the business elites be the leadership and the policymakers inside the Trilateral Commission. And so I'm not surprised to hear that there's 9 Chinese now involved, and I would expect that that would probably increase down the road. And so I think that the Trilateral Commission is one of the number of top policy groups in the world in terms of protecting global capital. So, and trying to make sure that capitalism grows, that there's safe investment opportunities worldwide, and anybody holding large amounts of capital is going to be interested in participating.
And another question, just indulging my own interests as usual, but can we just talk about Donald Trump, for example, and the significance of Donald Trump with the rhetoric of America first and unilateralism, protectionism, and so on, tariffs, etc. What does he do, and the messages that he put forward, and the kind of people he appointed, or some of the people he appointed to his own administration? What is the significance of Donald Trump and Trumpism to the kind of research, Nana, you've been doing, and the kind of research you've presented, Peter? Because he seems to buck the trend and stand much for nationalism, at least rhetorically, than internationalism.
I think that capital investment folks were fairly happy overall with Trump's policies. They were a little embarrassed by his rhetoric, his stupidity, to use a simple word, but and he offended people. I mean, Jamie Dimon and Larry Fink were on his advisory group. And then when he made racist statements relative to the Black Lives Matter movement in the country, they were planning to resign, and he just disbanded the group ahead of them. So he could say, well, I disbanded them, and they didn't just resign. Nonetheless, they recognize the importance of the presidency in terms of the Federal Reserve policies, things like that are there. Having said that, I don't have an easy answer for that question. Trump has managed to mobilize millions of racist patriots in this country, and can pull people out to vote and participate. And that's a position of power that most politicians haven't had. I mean, they get liked, but there's a kind of a social movement sort of process that's ongoing around Trump and Trumpism. And they're not very willing to give up. And it goes counter, of course, to civil rights and human rights, and protected and enjoyed by most of the people in our country. But those that have had an economic decline, in particular, the precariat, that are endorsing and protecting him. And having said that, I'm going to have to check out. I loved doing this. Somehow I think the time difference was confused. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. It's really interesting. We'll have to have you back for a bit of a longer time to speak and to elaborate on some of your thoughts as well. But thank
That'd
you.
be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Nana, given your interest in the liberal international order and the kind of underpinning of it by these corporate elite networks and so on, I just wondered if you could just sort of give us some idea about what is the significance of, how should we understand Trump and this kind of message? Because he's not gone away, and his level of popularity in the Republican Party hasn't slipped very much. And 70% of Republican voters believe that the election was stolen, that Biden is illegitimate in any case. And it looks like he's the most popular primaries presidential nominee for 2024 for the Republican Party as well. So we can't just sort of say, well, he's gone because he's gone from Twitter. He's very big and active on all sorts of other platforms.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of understand his significance in the context of your work?
Yeah, I tend to see Trump as a symptom of a crisis, of an underlying crisis, and which is partly a crisis of this liberal international elite and the way they have been insulated increasingly from society and benefiting the 1% and neglecting the rest. And Trump, of course, has been tapping into that discontent, basically. Not only Trump, you see these figures, political figures, of course, emerging everywhere in the West that are basically tapping into this discontent and channeling it, you know, combining different kinds of discontent with racism, with xenophobia, with all kinds of scary sentiments. And using that as its political, how to say, political, so political support for his power. Whether he's actually serving those interests is a whole different question, right? and I would say he isn't. He's of course serving the interests of the very rich in the US. And if you look at the actual policies that he implemented, aside from racist policies, it was to benefit the already very wealthy even more, right? So there he has a faithful electorate in the US as well. The only way Trump will probably go away is if this broader crisis, which is this economic crisis, a climate crisis, a social crisis, is effectively being coped with by the present administration. And we also see within, I think, the Biden administration, you already mentioned some examples, this institute you talked about, but also some people in his administration, and also some his policies, to be honest, are already going toward that direction, of course, also driven by the much more radical left wing of the Democratic Party. I'm not saying that the Biden administration will be able to solve these big issues, but you see that I see that they understand the necessity and the urgency of doing that in order to cope with the crisis that Trump was only a symptom of, and which I think he only aggravated, and will definitely not go away by itself just because he's banned from Twitter. I agree with you there.
Well, thank you so much, Nana. I know we kept you a bit longer than is comfortable for you, but really always appreciate your knowledge and your research as well. And maybe next time we can invite Bastian will be able to join us and
I hope so.
The kind of presentation as well. I want to say thank you, obviously, to Peter and to Nana, but also to Matias. We kept you a bit longer than usual, but the questions were flowing in, and we wanted to try to give you a bit of chance to clarify on some of those as well. So thank you so much. And if you have the capacity to do a short working paper for us to summarize some of your arguments, and we'd be very keen to publish that on our website as well. So Juvaria will be in touch with you about that. And but again, thank you so much to you and to Juvaria, but also to our audience, which is very patiently hung around for a lot longer as well. And so next week, I can't remember the topic that we are talking about. I think it's about white supremacy, racial capitalism, another very hot topic in world politics. So we'll be sending out the posters and publicity for that. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and hope to see you again next week.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. It was a great pleasure. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.